Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick Crouch from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Gorn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Hey, it's MJ from the Coaches Panel. I hope you are well. Number 25 in the 50 most relevant. We hit the halfway marker last night, yesterday morning. Whenever you were listening to it, we hit halfway. So what's the best way to go from a halfway marker? Start it the way you ended it. We're staying in the back line, staying chatting to MiniMonk. Mate, good to see you. Callum Mills. Look, there's not a whole big bit of deviation about what could be, but there is a world where he becomes one of the most impactful and relevant players if just one thing goes his way.
Yes, very much so. It's good to be back in back-to-back episodes. We've gone from a guy who a lot considered to be a very safe pick to a player that has a little bit more risk associated with him. But because of that, there's a hell of a lot more upside.
100%. He delivered us a seasonal average last year in AFL Fantasy. Didn't even crack the 70 marker. It has been a long time since we have seen Callum Mills around this territory of average as a result in fantasy and Dream Team. I can't recall seeing him this cheap, just flat out dirt cheap. It's on the screen for you if you're watching through on YouTube. While in SuperCoach, a seasonal average of 73.7 means he's coming at a price point in that format of just over $350,000. Just the 6 games last year. His season high score came against the Adelaide Crows right towards the end of it, a 98 in SuperCoach and a 107 in Fantasy. They're basically both about halfway to his career best scores, if I'm honest with you, though. He's a part of the 200 club. I famously remember this game. I think Minnie might have too. I think we both might have traded him in this week for the score too. 214 in SuperCoach and a 162 in AFL Fantasy. Minnie, it's hard to say someone's a victim of their own brilliance, but at times that's probably a fair sentiment for Callum Mills, because if there is a need for this Sydney team and a vacancy through either injury, selection, suspension, or just trying to get a different shape in their team, he becomes the movable piece, or at least historically has been the movable piece to fix. We need some support on the wing. Let's send him out there. We need him inside mid. Let's go win that contest. We need someone to lock down on a medium forward. We'll throw him back there. We need someone to intercept and be a general in this backline. That's probably the hardest and worst thing about Callum Mills from a fantasy perspective is if there's a need, he's able to fill it and do it at a world-class level.
Absolutely, he is. He is a phenomenal player, and I think it's taken us most of this year, 2024 and into the 2025, to realize just how good of a player he was when he was fit and fired. That 2022 season was something to behold in terms of not just a fantasy and SuperCoach sense, but in terms of how good a player he really was. He was leading those Swans to being a dominant team throughout a lot of that season. And his absence through injury in 2023, when he got injured early on in that game, and through 2024 was sorely missed by them. It's arguable that they could be a better team with him in the midfield when you've also got the likes of Heaney and Warner and Rowbottom in there. To say that he's a point of difference and can take that midfield to another level seriously tells you how good of a player he is. But as you said, he's a victim of his own success. He's a phenomenal player off halfback as well. He's been shown a propensity to be able to play wing, be able to play half forward and do tagging jobs, take kickouts. And that is the concern with a player like him, is his versatility leads him to being susceptible to wild scoring changes. And so I think that's what we need to start the discussion today is, where do we see him? What do we see that happening? And is there any reasons why that might change for the 2025 season?
Yeah, once you basically find your answers to those questions, your decision should be made about whether or not you are starting Callum Mills or you are fading Callum Mills in your starting squad. Like, you just look over these last 4 seasons. Everything went wrong last year. There was nothing that went right for him, from the off-season shoulder incident that ruled him out for 2/3 of the season, then does his hammy that robs him of that grand final appearance. And I am curious, while the Swans never really looked like in it, You take any team's captain out of their side, does that change the balance of this side a little bit? I just wonder. Regardless, he only had 4 games last year where he attended a centre bounce. The positive of that for us is this. It's how he's gained defensive status. So let's not hate on it too much, because that's the reason he's not only so relevant, becomes someone that's so highly desired and to be owned. Only really 2 decent scores in fantasy last year, a 91 and a 107. Again, coming off a really serious injury, and only the one decent sort of score in SuperCoach 2, the 98. The year prior, way better in 2023, but not at the heights of 22 and 21. 84 average in AFL Fantasy with 4 tons, SuperCoach average of 87 with 6 tons, going around that mid-30s to high 30s centre bounce attendance rate. There is an injury-impacted game in there that does dint that average. And then, of course, there is probably the years we're going to look back and say are the career fantasy and SuperCoach scores. Well, let's hope we get one more. 116, 112 in SuperCoach, 111, 109 in fantasy. Like, what a range these last 4 years have been for us, Minnie, from the peak of his powers to somebody that offers a little bit of value to someone that just breaks your heart. That's basically his last 4 years.
Absolutely. I mean, if you've been an owner of him in the 2021 and 2022 seasons, you probably have fond memories of him. You probably love the scores that he's been able to produce. Whereas if you've been an owner of him in 2023, particularly for that game where he got injured about 5 minutes into it on a 3 AF and a 4 SuperCoach, or you decided to pick him up in a draft league or trade into him right at the end of the 2024 season, you're probably not much of a fan of him. And there might be some perception towards him because of that. And I know that you say that those 6 games that he's had last year, there was only a couple of good games in them for fantasy and SuperCoach perspective. And yes, that's true. But he also isn't priced like he has been in the past. It's not like he's priced at 117 SuperCoach and 110 AF. It's not like he's even priced at 88 SuperCoach and, the 84 AF like he was in 2024 before the shoulder injury, which ruled him out. That's factoring in that injured score. He's priced in the 60s in both formats. So if he goes at that top range of, those couple of good games where he was back to full fitness, didn't get an injury, had reasonable time on ground, that's still presenting some pretty wild value for a player, let alone if he gets any semblance to what he has been in those peak years that we've talked about.
If he gets anywhere back to those peak years, well, now the conversation isn't just should Callum Mills be in the 50 most relevant and about the halfway junction. It's why isn't he number 1 if he gets that level of output? And the good thing, and I think it's important to double down on, is we don't need Callum to be that for us to be a successful pick. We just see a return to the un-injury impacted results of 2023 based on what he's priced at. There's a 20 points per game of upside. And that becomes someone that very comfortably you can run through to that mid-season buy, take all those data elements, know there are some favourable fixtures layered throughout those first few months, take a couple of nice scores, and away you go. So he does not have to get back to that 50, 60% centre bounce rate and those 110 score years to become a worthwhile selection. But I do have to ask you, Minnie, what role do you forecast and what role do you hear that he's going to hold in 2025? I know we'll get a free look in opening round, and I want to ask you more about that in a second, but what's your intuition? What's your research? What does everything you hear and see say about the role that Callum Mills is going to hold this year?
I mean, the role that I think he's going to hold is pretty similar to probably what he had in 2022. I think he's going to rotate between being a centre bounce midfielder and dropping behind the ball. And it's a pretty juicy fantasy role. We look at the Sydney midfield and you say, right, he's a full-time midfielder now. Rowbottom's a full-time midfielder. Warner's a full-time midfielder. And the thing about 2 out of those 3 mids is 2 out of those 3 mids in Heaney and Warner are so damaging forward of the ball. Right. They're not going to see 85, 90% CBAs like we do at other clubs when you're talking about their CBA mids. They're going to be in that 65 to 75% range. And then if we look at who the 4th and 5th midfielders were for the Swans in 2024, it was Errol Gordon, who's as damaging outside as he is inside and one of the probably premier midfielders to the competition because of that. But 33% of CBAs have actually just walked out of their team, being Luke Parker. And Luke Parker was a player that was rotating between mid and half forward. But the thing is, we know that Mills is more damaging behind the ball. Now, the other thing that we've seen is some training reports come out of the Swans. And whilst there is 2 midfields, we have to be concerned about that. He's playing midfield time. The round 0 game will help for us to be able to confirm it. But I think at this stage, it's fair to assume that he's probably going to be about 50% CBAs, probably about 50% behind the ball. And that, to me, is enough of a role to be heavily considering to what he can do. Because if we look back at that 2022 season, and, if we look at the CBAs in that season, it was Parker, it was Warner, it was Mills, it was Rowbottom. I'd expect if you just say Parker's out, Heaney's in, it's basically the same 4 going through that. And you don't have to look far to see how good a season that was for him. 116 SuperCoach and 111 AF. If he is 80% of that, that is a 90 average in SuperCoach and AF. That is more than enough.
That is a knockout pick. And that's not even stretching it to hyperbolic tendencies where, of course, as content creators, we could do that at times where we pour a little bit of mayo on a thought to try to get you to a thought process that we are either wanting you to think about or process. That's probably at the conservative end of what a fit Callum Mills could be.
I mean, if you even look at the 2023 season, we had that injured game. He got injured on the 3AF and the 4 SuperCoach. He's a relatively durable player. He's had a hamstring injury, had the freak shoulder injury. But let's just say that, let's just remove that game because sometimes we like to do that with players. But it's a nice and simple one here. That 2023 season was abjectly a poor season for him in fantasy and SuperCoach. If you remove that game, it's a 92.5 SuperCoach and an 88.5 fantasy. If that is what he does in 2025, that is still a success for a kid. That is still a successful player. And he had lower CBAs that year as well. He was only at that 35% marker. If that's all he gets and he averages about 90 in both of them, fantastic. That's great. That's all you need to really hear for someone like Mills.
It's so true. And not only is that important that we look at Heaney and Warner for what they can do centre forward of the ball, they've also had some improvements on the wings too. Goulden is much more developed than he was 2 years ago, where he was a high half forward that would push up the grounds. He is an out-and-out pure midfielder now. Justin McInerney has really developed on and become an underrated link-up piece for their transition ball movement. Matt Roberts has drifted back but has also played through the wings as a really underrated ball mover and user. Nick Blakey's knocked on the door of the All-Australian squad over the last 2 years, and these have all happened with Mills not really getting a great run of it from an injury perspective. And while we always should consider an injury history, I think the fact with Mills is nothing feels interconnected and related about it, though, does it, MiniMonk? It's not an Isaac Rankin that's got a growing history of hamstring-related issues or a set of concussions that ultimately become an alarming feat for us. For us, it's almost Lockie Whitfield territories where it's weird and it's random and
just
not
freak.
Seemingly connected and freak stuff. So while you don't ever want to discount an injury narrative, it is important to look at it for what it is. And so I'd probably put the injury-prone tag, quote unquote, on Mills to say it's fair but unjustified in the sense of it being a reason to not select. But you've talked about this potential role through the midfield and this potential structural piece. It does seem and feel like Sydney are going to change a few things up a little bit. Even something as simple as Tom McCartan training in the forwards. Now, it's against each other. They're just experimenting, but it does give you some illusion and hint to under Dean Cox, it's not just going to be copy and paste what Longmire has run. So does that give you any hesitancy? Because while we project a 40-50 midfield split here of in the midfield and then drifting behind the ball, is there a world for you that you could see him positioned in such a way that it becomes fantasy kind of morbid and useless to us?
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first, like to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary. and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
Sergeant and Mr. Smith, you're gonna love this house.
Bunk beds in a closet?
There's no field manual for finding the right home. But when you do, USAA Homeowners Insurance can help protect it the right way. Restrictions apply.
I think he's too good a player to just become like a lame duck and not find his way to get the ball. The Swans are a good team, yes, and there are a lot of players that demand the ball, but they also have a lot of players that want to get the ball into other players' hands. You talk to people talk about the likes of Blakey, the likes of Gould, and the likes of Heaney. These are players that want the ball in. Mills is another player they do love to give the ball to. But even if there is a game style shift, even if there is that element of concern, we're yet to see a preseason game, and we still have round 0 to see how the Swans want to play. If we see a dramatic game style shift compared to what they played under Longmire, and now we just see that they want to move the ball fast, they're not really putting into the players like Mills, like Blakey's hands, they are really just slingshotting it, we'll know. And that's why when we come to round 0 and we come to players like Mills, like, Coleman, like Roberts, who we're concerned about roles for in round 0, we actually go in and have a think about what is it that I want to see from this sort of player? What is it that I would want to see from Mills in order for me to pick him? Is it that I want high CBAs? Is it that I want a good score? Is it that I want him to be taking kickouts? Do I need to see a game style certainty from the Swans themselves? For Mills, it's things like, what is his CBA mix? What's his kick to handball ratio? What is his points per minute? What's his time on ground?
Yeah.
Like, if he's hitting 80% time on ground, if he's hitting above a points per minute of about 0.9, and if he's getting a few marks and a few tackles, those are the sorts of indicators where you're going, they clearly want to give him the ball. They're clearly trusting that his body is fit, and he's clearly looking like the Mills of the past. It's never just one indicator. It's not a blanket line saying, if he scores above 80, I'll pick him. If he scores below 80, I won't pick him.
Yeah.
It's what other indicators does it look like for this player for me to be considering him? And for someone like Mills, it should be a fairly obvious spread of points. Like, can he hit the different categories? Has he got a reasonable kick to handball ratio? Because, normally it's around about the 1.1 to 1.3 marker. And is he playing enough time on ground to be actually able to accumulate the ball?
If he's getting anything like a normative Callum Mills time on ground, I think for me, you could have almost zero concerns about him because he scores in every single column. He's one of the most really well-rounded footballers that he hits that defensive elements. He has that offensive stuff. He can take those marks. He can lay those tackles. He can win the ball in a contest. He can spread and get uncontested footy. So I think you're right. Even if I see him in opening round, only attending 1 in 3 centre bounces, the fact he's in and through there and that time on ground, barring something else in that line popping that makes me trump him, I'm probably still very confident to do that. It does become a challenge if you're also liking the looks of Roberts, Holmes, Coleman, Perryman, Stewart, who are all defenders on bye in that round. But of all of those ones, the player that feels like he offers the combination of greatest scoring ceiling alongside the greatest scoring upside, he to me feels like the one where those two things converge. Mills could be the premier option of all of those defenders.
Especially when we're screaming out for some sort of just pick-me type players in our defense. We talked about Sinclair yesterday as being a player where he's safe and there's not really much upside. And yes, you can have a couple of those in your backline. But below the Mills price tag, it's really just Kadeem Coleman that people have been looking at. And then you're starting to get towards the rookies who, at this time of the preseason, we don't know what rookies are going to come through, let alone how many there's going to be. Mills could end up being in people's teams anywhere from a D2, D3, all the way down to a D5, and maybe even some teams might experiment with him at D6. But at least he's a stable player to say, I'm locking in him. He's going to sit on my backline no matter what. I'll figure out the rest around him. And that might just be the easiest way to think about him is that, yes, he's got that round 3 bye. Yes, there's a few others, but at least I see the greatest return on investment associated with him compared to the others.
100%. The beautiful thing about starting him, and should it fail, He becomes an easy parachute pathway to the mid-price defender that's popping, a D'Ambrosio-type player from 2024, or conversely, as Minnie said, he's your easy avenue to a restructure. Cash him down to that rookie that you missed, and all of a sudden, that mid-price guy you were banking on in another portion of your team, you can go and get them on whatever pathway you like. Equally, if he gets just to the 2023 territories of a high 80s average, he's doing enough, let alone that pathway to where he could still be a 110 defender. The range of outcomes feel big, but they don't feel high-level risk to not start Callum Mills, because if you go against him and he flies out of the tree, much like he's previously shown he can, that's these missed mid-price range guys, and you choose to go against them, these are the type of fades that end up costing you success in your side. But draft is so wide open to me, Minnie. Here at the Coaches Panel, we choose to draft on the Keeper platform, whether it be because of you want to do a single season, dynasty, or Keeper league. The Keeper platform has unrivaled customizations. It is incredible and functional. We've had a bit of a look and play behind the scenes at what draft day is going to look like. And trust me, friends, you don't want to miss out on drafting on the Keeper platform. But I could see a world where two big outcomes happen. There is people that are like, what, Callum Mills is a defender this year? I remember him from that 2021-2022 stuff the average. He's my D1. And then I can also see people drafting off average and with some burned hesitancy of role and injury history and going, oh, if he's there in my last defender, I'll get him. Where do you think he goes? Because I think both parts of the draft community feel like they're right. Is it somewhere in the middle? Is it somewhere leaning left or right? Where do you see Callum Mills going on draft?
The thing with draft, and this is always talked about, is that it only takes one person and he's off the board. And someone will remember that ceiling that he's been able to produce in 21 and 22. Someone will look at him and say, you know what? I think I'm going to take the punt on him. So I think if you're trying to get him as your last defender on field, be it a 5-7-1-5 or a 3-4-1-3 draft, I think either of those, you're not going to get Mills. He will be taken as someone's D1. Someone will reach, but I don't blame them for reaching, because if he goes at a semblance of what he can do and he goes at 100, they're going to get insane value. They're going to get a player that, would be drafted around people that be taken that are 90 to 95 averages, and he is going to outperform them. I've listened to both Mitch from the Ball Boys and Steve from the Draft Doctors talk about it. He's a tier breaker. He would be at the bottom of the tier 1 defenders, but if he pops, he could be the D1. He literally could be the highest averaging defender across the formats for 2025. That is within his realm of possibilities. Equally within his realm of possibilities is just going at what he is, and he's a D2 averaging player. And if you take that as your D1, it's not the end of the world. But if you get him and he becomes the D1, then you're absolutely laughing.
Oh, absolutely. He's been a fun player to own in keeper leagues. It does feel like for keeper owners, some redemption might come for them after holding through a little bit of a challenging 12 months. So hold on, Callum Mills keeper owners. This could be your redemption year. Hey, an absolute privilege, as always, talking to you, MiniMonk, about players throughout this 50 most relevant. Promise to get you back a handful more times before we wrap the series up.
We've got a handful more Dockers to go, do we?
Well, maybe. Maybe.
I'm looking forward to it.
Maybe. I'm going to have to give a docker to somebody else just to throw everybody off the scent. That's the only way I'm going to make my way through this. Hey, if you want to go back and listen through any of these episodes or watch any of these episodes through the series, maybe you're just getting going with your fantasy footy pre-season because you're back at work, back at study, and you're like, I need something to distract me. I'll go listen to the Coaches Panel. We got you. You go back and listen to these audio podcasts wherever you're listening to this. Make sure you give us a 5-star rating and leave a review if you can do so. It makes a big difference for us. And if you are watching this on YouTube and you haven't subscribed, do it. Turn the notifications on. We got videos dropping every day in the preseason with stats, players, positions, strategies, ideologies to help you navigate this preseason. All the details of how to get in touch with us are in the description of this episode too, as well as where you can become a part of our Patreon and also get your hands on some Coaches Panel merch. All right, you want a clue for who's up tomorrow? Let me give you one. We're only a couple of years removed from this guy at one point in time having an unbelievable feat attached to his name. There was a portion of a season a few years ago where he was averaging over 120 in one format and literally less than a point away from that in the other. And chances are, ever since that time, you've not really considered him. But he's unbelievable value if you contrast his price point to what he did in that incredible stretch of games. And the even scarier thing is, I think he could go even bigger. Who am I talking about? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 Most Relevant.